Afternoon. 2 days before Shell. It was getting near lunch and Tom checked his Omnipad. It seemed as good a time as any to take stock of the day. Miv's right. I've been climbing the walls. There was a text from Berdine. The IOTC girls were doing well and would hold up their part to play in the banquet. That's nice. I feel guilty as hell if Vadim weren't dating a princess. That kind of evens things up. And his suit was going to be delivered tonight. Tom sighed and shook his head. Berdine was calm as a clam. Whatever it was, it couldn't be worse than the warden's outfit. The little shill could make you believe in reincarnation, because he definitely had the soul of Liberace. Still, it was only one evening. Surely a state dinner couldn't be that bad. It was a crowd of scientists and assorted nobility, for goodness sake. It's not the audience I'm worried about. There was a message from Lamana Davari. The interior agent had been cooperative, though we could tell she wasn't happy about this plan. She was deferring to her princess, but Davari favoured playing for time. There was just something about sitting back and waiting that didn't have any appeal. She wasn't the one with a knife in her guts. That wasn't fair. Whatever else you could say about the woman, if she'd been asked to trade places, she wouldn't have hesitated. The woman's dedication was frightening, the more so because she spent most of her day in her disguise as Professor Davari, totally normal person. Well, except for the orchestra. Mel and Caslin say she's perfectly at home. The woman would probably lend a whole new terror to Ode to Joy. At least she'd followed through, and gods love her, so had Zenshiki. She'd explained her ability to evade most censors, but the last 3 nights she'd slipped out on campus to try something new. She'd texted every time, and according to Davari, the death's heads in the bunker missed her every time. Whatever she's doing, it can make all the difference. The women in the bunker, like Solani. Things shouldn't go wrong, but how many times had he said that? Something wasn't right. The feeling he was missing something loomed over him. Fuck it. Time to call Solani. He'd promised, and Miv would be gone for hours. Besides, it might make him feel better. Deep in the ops room out in the bunker, Sergeant Diani perked up from her station. Captain, you're not going to believe this. He's calling her now. You're putting me on. Captain Biona felt her eyes grow wide. The woman can't string 2 sentences together when she wakes up. We're recording this, aren't we? Yala asked from the ground team console. She threatened to sodomize me with a las rifle over breakfast. Biona steepled her fingers and smiled guilelessly. Oh, deeps we are. Document that sucker. Mivere was a stunning woman. Tall even for a Shovanti, she was statuesque yet elegant. She had poise, and it showed. Shalea was equally striking, though lithe, slim and feisty. At 6'2", Tom never thought he'd end up as the short one in the family, but somehow neither woman made him feel that way, and were feminine in the way Shovanti women usually were. Both women behaved just like human women, with all their cares and concerns, except when they didn't. When they didn't, they really didn't. It could be disconcerting to have your attitudes reflected back when you least expected it, but that was their normal. Shovanti men? Well, given the social pressures put on them, they behaved like human women, though he'd only met a few before leaving Earth. It was a rule of thumb that worked reasonably well. It applied fairly well to the men working as cooks and waiters at human food, and he'd been comfortable with adapting in a way. When in Rome, and the men had made an effort to help him adapt. After all, he was on Shill, the odd man out, in the most literal sense. That said, there were young men like Aku and Vadim, who seemed to face their worlds in understandable ways. Then again, he'd also come to know Jama. While age had slowed him down, words like notorious and brazen tended to find their way into his thoughts. There were even a few men about, like Burdine, where words like florid tended to flounder, unequal to the task. But all of them were at home with their lives. This was their normal, and he was the outsider looking in. He'd adapted. Staring at his omnipad, he punched in the number, but held off dialing. What did he know about Solani? They shared a morning together, and Miv and Leia approved. Once, that would have been difficult to accept. Now, it still took getting used to. There was also the fact that she was military. Not just a Marine, but a Death's Commando, and while the difference was lost on him, it mattered. You couldn't avoid meeting Shovanti Marines. Young, dumb, and full of expectations, young troops were the same everywhere. They usually tended to piss off the locals. Taken as a whole, it reminded Tom of his time on Okinawa. The governor of the island had been aggressively against the American bases there, and rightly supported policies to stop sexual violence against local women. The most dangerous animals on the island were, after all, several thousand unaccompanied Marines, though it was also rumoured his daughter had been caught with a young airman in the back of a Chevy. The guy had to be smuggled off the island one night with extreme prejudice. All of that came home to roost with the Shovanti occupation. What had gone around had come around in the form of young, inexperienced and hopeful girls turned loose on the sex planet. They had gone over just as well as anyone should have expected. If anything, humanity ought to have known better than the shill, but it was still a shock to the system. Once the red zones calmed enough to allow the settlement programs to kick in, families had arrived on Earth. Shovanti, Rakiri, Helcom. By fits and starts, each had started to appear, along with the other, more exotic races in the Imperium. For a while, it had turned into a hobby like train spotting, but somehow people found their niches and things got on. The galaxy came calling, and it turned out that people were just people. The Marines were the problem. Not as individuals, but as young troops out of their depth, in a situation they weren't right for. Not that the interior was anyone's choice, even for the shill, but after a while people got on. Well, most did. God, I'm going to miss Kat. He banished the weight of old memories and focused. Solani was, well, not a Marine, but the thought stuck in his head. Her letter had been hopeful, not young or inexperienced. The music she sent along had been thoughtful, expressing her longing, desire, and optimism in a way that touched the heart, presuming she understood the words. Either that or she'd gotten lucky. Still, taken as a whole, words like daunting tried to edge their way into his thoughts. Personally, she was polite, deferential to Miv and Leia, and had already put herself on the line for him more than once. Physically, though, the woman screamed military. Solani Tonnes was a beautiful woman with a defined chin and piercing gold eyes, though it was difficult not to think of her body first. Once someone threw you over their shoulder and took off at a dead run, it made a lasting impression. Athletic, in the way that you'd say Arnold Schwarzenegger was well-defined, everything about the woman said focused, though that seemed normal for Shovanti women. For better or worse, Solani had focused on him, and Miv and Leia approved. That was how things stood, and he needed to call the Uber girl and make a date. Just when I thought it would stop feeling strange. Tom shook his head and hit the icon to dial. The omnipad rang a few times, and Tom was about to give it a miss when the call connected. While he didn't enable the feature often, she must have had video on. The Uber girl lay mashed into her pillow, eyes screwed shut as she started to gently snore. Hi, Solani? Somehow, her camera lay at an odd angle, barely keeping her in the frame, and Tom turned his to match. Hello? It's Tom. Tom's cute. Solani rolled back and snorted once. Part of him considered hanging up, but he lingered in bemused fascination as she carried on talking in her sleep. All those women chasing. I beat their asses, and he's cute. The polite thing to do would be to hang up and call back later. It wasn't as if he was going to get anything sorted. Still, it seemed rude not to say something. Besides, if this was recording on her end, the least he could do was leave a useful message. So, would you like to go out for something to eat? Nice restaurant. Does wrestling. Solani rolled over, her arm flailing at the omnipad, knocking it askew. Builds credits. Ah. If she slept during the day, maybe she worked nights. This seems to be a bad time, so maybe dinner? The omnipad offered a view of the ceiling. Dinner's good for wrestling pages. Okay, I'll set something up. There was no way not to make this awkward, but if there wasn't a recording, the worst he could do was call back. Sweet dreams. Shaking his head, he broke the call. Alright, maybe not so daunting then. A date won't be so bad, at least we'll have something funny to talk about, if it's humorous from a Shilvanti perspective. From a Shilvanti perspective. The thought stuck in his head, and he punched in a text to Lamana Davari. Need to meet you this afternoon. Bring cadets. Important. Zinchiki did things the Persian way. The Shul did things the Shul way. And he'd been approaching this whole banquet from a human perspective. And maybe that was all wrong. As Pathfinder of the Natashja Warband, Sunchaser had known Maraket since she was a mere kit named Marast. Admittedly, she was only 43 Pesh years older, or 5, going by the local calendar, but the years were enough. When she started training as a Pathfinder under Old Starwise, her mentor instructed her to pay attention to the young kits as well as the adults. They'd be her peers one day, and as the future warriors and band mothers of the wood spirits, knowing them was important. So it was that she remembered Maraket being born, and watched her grow from a kit. Starwise had lived up to his name. She'd not only learned to deal with other warbands and the art of contract law, she'd also come to appreciate her family more intimately than most. She knew their strengths and weaknesses. She'd come to appreciate their character as a whole. She'd been the odd woman out, the social one, though that wasn't so unusual for a Pezrin. Everything back home on Pesh depended on who you knew, who you were related to, who you had or hadn't eaten. Social ties were everything. The only remarkable thing was that she managed to remain social, coming from a family of dour, uncommunicative, introverted. Well, they were family. At least if they found it hard to laugh at themselves, she was there to do it for them. In that respect, Maraket was everything a bandmother of the Natashja should be. Not without a certain dark and severe sense of humour, but still. You're pulling my Asaic. Sunchaser crossed her arms, her Asaic swishing uncertainly. I have never pulled your Asaic, though if you want amputation. Pathfinder sighed. Naturally, it would be Zinchiki. Talk about the prodigal daughter. So, it's a brothel? Like, really a brothel? She pinched the bridge of her nose a moment and rallied. Well, I suppose if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. But Mother of Light, there's such a thing as overcompensation. Maraket stared balefully and groomed her Asaic. Sunchaser took the hint. Alright, you're not kidding. Scout me through this from the beginning and stop me when I'm wrong. Your daughter found a boy, a Pezrin boy, in a brothel. Sunchaser supplied helpfully. Maraket continued grooming. The pause grew longer, but she knew how to wait. After all, Marraket had come to her.
You are not speaking. Oh, you just noticed? Because I was hoping that was the point where you were going to stop me.
Marraket arched an eyebrow.
Then you must learn to live with disappointment. Daily.
Sunchaser looked at her another moment. Sometimes it was good to remember you loved your family enough to eat them, and some days you wanted to eat them so you didn't have to remember you loved them.
I see. So this past is in a brothel. You think she's getting tied to him? He is the right age, and she is very much in the right season. It is possible.
Marraket shrugged slightly. Anyone not familiar with her would have missed the gesture. From her it was positively eloquent, but she unbent slightly.
You are just repeating what we already know. I hope by the time I returned, you'd have found out more about the Rifagian. Don't get hasty in your middle age. It's not your style.
Sunchaser snorted.
I'm just laying the trail here. Please tell me you did some scouting. Why don't you and the other band mothers just break the boy out? Sinchiki can grab him by the... Of course I scouted, Marraket replied tartly. That is the problem. Right. Well, that's clear as the bottom of a coal mine at midnight.
Sunchaser settled back. Being the extrovert in the family was a penance sometimes, but Marraket gave her pause. The woman was a careful hunter, but had never been afraid to be the first to use violence. She used it as a tool, usually as a scalpel and sometimes as a blunt object, but if she said violence wasn't the answer, it likely wasn't. This was going to be one of those conversations where she just had to drag the information out.
So you scouted. Are you going to tell me the problem, or just let me guess? The tide pool is not merely a brothel. The people work there, apparently by choice.
Marraket paused significantly. Sunchaser appreciated the effort, as that was a lot to take in.
The men and women there, and there are more species than I have ever seen, all consider themselves employees. I spoke with 4 or 5, and the ones that don't consider themselves entertainers for the clients are there as staff. They are all healthy, happy, and abundantly well paid. Well, money can't buy you happiness, but if that's true, you could die trying. That is humor. That is an observation, she replied a bit tartly, turning the matter over in her mind and weighing it against what she'd been able to uncover. Look, prostitution is a filthy business everywhere we've been. Places like that in the Consortium are little better than slave houses, and the Alliance was worse. Men and boys beaten down into lifeless outcasts. No one looks at them as anything but toys, until they're too old or too used up, and then they just get cast aside. Sure, actual slavery is a filthy business, but it's only illegal because otherwise no man would be safe anywhere. It's bad enough here with the Silver Suns, but that's better than the Alliance or Consortium. At least the Imperium tries to stop it. You said this place has a lot of money rolling through. If it's everything you're saying, then something is going on. So I surmised, Marraket said blithely. Of the Wood Spirit 7 band mothers, Marraket was her favourite, but Sunchaser counted to 8, her patience getting thin. Based on? The tide pool employs Rikiri security, but the staff were armed. She finished grooming her aside and let it fall free, discreetly but still. Sunchaser passed that over. An armed staff wouldn't be easy to subdue. No gang would allow it. And Rikiri? Rikiri were capable fighters and should be respected, if not invited to dinner. But still, birds flew, fish swam, they did what they did supremely well and were both good eating. That didn't make them interchangeable. Rikiri don't make good criminals. Sunchaser tapped a claw on the bulkhead thoughtfully. It's just not in their nature. Marraket's fur arched and settled, displaying she was pleased with herself. Exactly. So when you say armed, do you mean a little, quite, or very? My waiter was carrying a knife on a leg strap, and the security woman I saw had X-Tel GP5s. Flechette pistols.
Sunchaser felt herself staring despite herself.
Light-nose are nasty. Exactly how many staff are in this place? I have seen smaller fortresses, Marquette said flatly. Bigger than the... Yes.
Sunchaser felt her stomach purge as the conversation ground to a halt again. When Marquette got into monosyllables, that was about it for information. That made it her turn.
I heard back from Moonwhisper. She's wed to their band male, and he's on good terms with the male in the Tromoika.
She felt a moment's gratification as Marquette winced slightly. As an extrovert stuck in a family of reclusive mercenaries, a little exposition was her best revenge. Still, there was no need to push it.
They confirmed the Refagian arrived on Shill a year or so after they did. They took a contract with Duchess Eliana, our employer. Funny she's never mentioned it. I am laughing on the inside. Really? I'd love to cut you open and hear what that sounds like, because thanks to your daughter, we find the quiet old commodities trader employing us lost a warband. Not just some of them, the whole family. That means there's something up with the Duchess on one side and a fortress on the other.
Sunchaser pulled her aside in raw frustration.
You know what that means?
You undercharged?
Marquette said archly.
Yes!
Sunchaser wailed, slamming her fist against the wall. It was humiliating, but she had to make the best of it.
Are you and the other band mothers going to tell Lafkia?
Our husband? Not at this point.
This could involve slavers, violence, kidnapping and mayhem.
Naturally, but Lafkia is still learning to use his prosthetic leg. Getting us out of consortium space cost him dearly, and we don't want him to think he is missing out. Or that we're out of practice, Marquette sighed. Unless we can afford something better, he would slow us down. We are not risking him, so the less he hears, the better.
Somehow, Zenshiki had negotiated actual land for the Natasha. But while land and hers were a fortune for posterity, until the lands were actively worked, they remained a fortune out of reach. In the meantime, every spare credit that wasn't being put into their ship now had to be ploughed into renovations. That included the money set aside to provide Lafkia with a good prosthetic, but he'd insisted. The savings was far more than he'd earned with work from the Duchess, and Sunchaser nodded grimly, acknowledging his sacrifice. It was something he could do for the family, and no one was going to take that from him.
Why did you not marry Lafkia as well? Marquette asked.
The question caught Sunchaser by surprise.
I'm a little old for that.
She pondered the idea. Starwise had negotiated well when she brought Lafkia into the family from the Condriol. Normally the price for a man like that would break a family for a year, but he was as laconic as Marquette. They loved each other dearly, but the idea of sharing quarters with them all? Torture.
That's very kind. Marriage may be a wonderful institution, but I don't want to be institutionalized.
As usual, Marquette's psych did the talking for her, and Sunchaser leaned in to rub shoulders with her friend.
So this past?
She asked circumspectly. The sting of undercharging was painful, but a male, on the loose, with no family charging a dowry for him? Now that was a bargain.
Good-looking boy, is he?
I can possibly see the attraction, the band mother shrugged.
You threatened him?
She asked mildly. It was an unusual situation, but there were the formalities to consider.
Yes,
she nodded briefly.
Appropriate to his situation.
Good, good. And Lafkia might like having a young male to bring into the family.
Sunchaser desperately wanted to rub her hands together, but a Pathfinder should never display greed. Just embrace it.
It would be good for the family. The girls are getting older, and you know Cathlis would be thrilled to have a share of him. Patafri doesn't get on well with Zenshiki, but she'll either adjust to being third or go without. I can't say I don't agree with you.
Coming from Marrakech, that was practically a manifesto. The woman's Asaic actually perked with joy. If she had a least favourite bandwife, it was Harasov, and Pudvari was her daughter. Despite her unusual choice of a human Hakhakt, Zenshiki had brought the family land. If she brought home a male, her place as the next bandmother would be uncontested by her band sisters, including Harasov and Padviri.
Who are we to stand in the way of true love? It's been so long since we've had a wedding. It will do the family good since we're so far from home, Sunchaser said firmly, setting her thoughts in order. There was still a great deal to find out about the Ruthagian, but they were Niblifos. Not enemies, but certainly not allies. Besides, any distant branches didn't even know about the boy.
Are you thinking what I'm thinking?
Marrakech nodded thoughtfully.
If he has no family, who do we eat?
Berdin Dasari watched Jedri Shalara expectantly. As a cadet senior agent in the IOTC, she'd proven over the last week she could be driven, demanding and determined. While polite and properly deferential to him, she'd battered down barriers to anything less than perfection in her troops, and was ready to face the worst things the galaxy had to offer. He sniffed at the waist. In another life, she would have made a fabulous maître d'. As it was, she made a marvelous test subject for his latest dessert.
That is absolutely the most disgusting thing I've ever seen,
she breathed in horrid fascination as Vadim picked up one of the rectangular mounds. Industrial brown goo discharged suggestively from the sides, but what really captured the eye was the sticky mass oozing out the sides. Cadet Agent Vandra Alidra leaned in for a closer look before turning pale.
I'm going to be sick.
Still, none of them made a dash for the bathroom or had the option to refuse. Vadim appreciated that since Vadim was handing them out. Over the last week, his son had truly come into his own, training them day after day. And if that wasn't enough, who cared? He was the princess's boyfriend. What could they say?
What in the sweet goddess's name is that?
Cadet Agent Prindria Mandis prodded at hers with horrified fascination, moving it about on the plate before pulling it apart. A visceral horror crept over her features, at the white morass dribbling down, clinging suggestively in ropey white tendrils.
Do you know what this looks like?
Vadim Dasari grinned cheerfully and picked up his own. Like porn and shell morning? One long entrail dribbled suggestively. Don't worry, the best things in life are a little sticky. Berdin felt a warm glow of pride in his son. He comes so far, so fast. Vadim smiled compassionately at the girls. Even in their distress, none of them were willing to show weakness. They watched in horror as he picked up his piece and bit deeply. Thick goo surged from the crust, coating one tusk. Prindi Amandis looked like she was going to faint. They're called, s'mores. Just try a nibble, please. For me? Surely you're not afraid, are you? Vadim tried wiping the sticking mass from his mouth. It trailed away on one fingertip. He gave them a winsome smile. This can't be the messiest thing you've thought of trying with a boy. Jedri was withering. Vandra looked at her for moral support as Prindi started to wheeze. As the senior cadet, she seemed to be fortifying herself, just as her omnipad rang. Snatching the unit from her belt, she held it like a talisman.
I've got to get this. Vandra, you try it?
Well, you couldn't win them all over at once. A love of fine cuisine didn't come to everyone naturally. Deirdre's lower lip quivered, but she picked up the square and gulped. What's in it? The brown stuff is chocolate. It's a vegetable, sort of. Vadim ran a fingertip along his own. She and Prindy watched, spellbound. If some savages simply couldn't appreciate good food, what was one to do? Still, there came a time for selling yourself, and at last Vadim was learning. Sort of? Prindy asked nervously. Don't worry. I'm sure big girls like you can get a handle on it. Vadim's tongue snaked out and wound around the brown-coated finger suggestively. And the white stuff? Vandra whispered hoarsely. Marshmallow. Vadim smiled sinfully at the pair. Bodine couldn't be more proud. All his son needed was a bit more fashion counseling, and nothing would stand in his way. The universe would deliver itself to him on a platter. Of course, first they still needed a test. Some people just had inexplicable tastes. All right. Prindy and Vandra shared a look and took a bite. Deirdre Shalara hung up on her omnipad, suddenly all business. Girls, there was a call from... Anyway, we have to get back to the campus at once. The cadets looked like they found their way to Shill's own bedroom. Oh, thank goddess, Vandra said as she gobbled it down. This is the best thing I've ever fasted. Well, of course it is, Birding exclaimed before checking his reflection. As hard as it was to believe, some people just didn't understand the things an artist had to endure. Diani brayed like a Turox when she laughed, but at least the girls enjoyed themselves. Yala was wiping tears from her eyes when Biona turned off Tom's monitor. She hadn't laughed outright. Well, maybe a bit. Right, eyes back on the job, she rumbled. Diani was still snickering, but they had a job to do, and Biona nodded as the sergeant ran a status check on her board. They had a sacred trust, and while breaks in the monotony kept you sharp, they couldn't become actual distractions. The board was clear. Princess Kalira was just settling down to lunch with her friends. Ma'am, Captain Tonnis still has her wake-up call for 4? Diani settled back. Same as every day, right? Mm-hmm. A pod leader should not laugh at their peers in front of the grunts. Biona stomped on the chuckle as it threatened to escape and throttled it. Diani glanced over her shoulder. Yala? 5 credits says she doesn't remember a thing. Sergeant, that is unkind. She pulled up the maintenance check from Pod 8. I'll make it 20. Grow a pair or go home. It was good for morale. It was barely noon, and Desi was already worn out. The files of nerve were starting to blur together every night, but she dug in and kept careful track. Still, the late nights were taking their toll. Even lunch had taken on an aspect of grim determination over the last week, and while it had been useful, Desi missed the days when it was just the carefree banter that started the year. She wouldn't trade her friendship with Melondi for anything, but the revelation had changed everything. Well, alright, Zinchiki would have shown up anyway, and she seemed impervious to change. She certainly wasn't what Desid imagined a sister to be. The Persian was seated next to her, prodding the tossip out of the baked guara from today's menu with deep suspicion. So, I want to bring something up. Jacksme cleared her throat. Desi nodded as the other girls all looked over at Melondi. They knew what was coming, and just now their princess had her mouth full. It's about the calendar. Mel, Kalira, was good at reading body language, but Desi suspected the whole table staring at her gave it away. Well, except for Zinchiki. She started prying bits of fish from the sauce and took a moment to catch on. Jax didn't waste time and dove right in. I know you've been wondering about the news and the calendars. Well, that and 1 or 2 other things. I sort of rolled part of the money into another product. You know that Rubik's thing? I sort of passed that off from my cousin, and we have an opportunity to market the Chelxa block. But... Melondi was trying to finish her bite, so Jax pressed ahead. Well, anyway, taking out the seed money for the printing and my uncle's 1% cut for the marketing, they sold out the first and second runs, and we have an offer to do another. Okay. Mel bit her lip and frowned at the attention. How much money is that? And why are you all looking at me? Well, we got around a credit per calendar, and my uncle said it sold nearly as well as something called a Sports Illustrated edition. We got an offer from them, by the way, once he mentioned the diving team. Melondi had gotten used to eating through unexpected news, and started picking at her papaya. How much? Jax bit her lip. Allowing for the conversion rate? Fine. Allowing for that. Mel canted her head, looking at Jaxme warily. For both runs? Jax shrugged. Around 800,000 credits. Melondi dropped her papaya. What? For pictures of us in bikinis? That's... Jax nonchalantly flipped a long wavy lock of silver hair over one shoulder. The most successful school fundraiser ever! Jax looked smug, but Desi decided to get things back on track. The point is, we wanted to talk to you about the money, Mel. We've all talked it over, and we're setting it aside for you. I was going to say preposterous, but why for me? Mel looked at her as confusion replaced consternation. Desi, I think you all know I'm, socially secure. We were going to split that. I mean, back when we thought it would just be fun money, but this? I don't understand. Why would you give it to me? It's not giving it to you, Mel. Pris leaned forward. Well, not as such. It's more like setting it aside. We need to give some to the school, but we ran it through Desala. Desala pushed her tray away and made a face. What they're trying to say is you might need money that can't be traced. I don't understand, Mel said flatly, though there was a defensive note in her voice, and Desi suspected she understood perfectly. What if you have to run? What if this banquet goes badly? Desala waved a hand briefly at the table, taking everyone in. We know you don't want to hear this, but if it's life or death, you may need to disappear for a while. It's not like your face is known by the press, but word wouldn't take long, Lark pointed out with a nod. Not if the palace made an announcement or your identity was blown. Zinchiki stabbed some tossip on one fork, examining it critically.
If the people stalking you decided it'd help them flush you out, they'd do so in a minute. They're right, Neswa nodded. My mother's toed the line when the palace wants something silenced, but if it got totally out in the open, even they'd try and take the lead. Every news outlet and pundit would be offering up something on the datanet. We decided to create a fund to make that happen, if it needs to. Jaxme lowered her voice. My family has a few ships here on Shill. We could get you off-world. My family on Willis would take you in, Belden nodded. There are all kinds of places you can disappear out on the ranch. Or maybe farther, said one of the twins. Mara and I were thinking about Earth. If we asked, maybe the painters could take you on their ship. I could fool people for a few days, at least the ones off campus, Desi whispered, as she reached out to take Melondi's hand. If I slept in your room and we let Redeem in on it, maybe I could throw them off and give you a head start. I appreciate it. All of you. Mel looked down at her plate. Her hands fluttered a moment before she clasped them together. But no, I'm not running away from this. How would this look if I ran at the first sign of danger? The first sign of danger was in the library. Pris's voice was full of compassion, but her words made sense. Desi was about to chime in when Mel put her foot down. No! I know you're thinking of me, but what kind of person cuts and runs like that? Melondi glowered. Zinchiki, you aren't Shilvanti.
What would it look like to your people? How could I live with myself like that?
Easily another 50 years. Longer if you can make money posing in skin suits. The peasant girl frowned. A bandmother would not run, but that is different. We are surrounded by family.
You're my family, Mel said wretchedly, before drawing in a long breath. Look, you've all taken risks for me, and I know you don't want that to be for nothing, but I'm not running away. I couldn't respect myself. Thank you, but no matter what happens, I am not doing that.
We had to offer.
The other twin, that would be Caslin, reached out for the bed tray.
Anyway, it wouldn't have been so bad if you went to Earth. We want to know what a Rolls is.
A what?
It was a non sequitur, but Desi grabbed it like a lifeline.
Melondi was embarrassed. That was something a princess couldn't afford, and changing the topic was something they could all do for her.
Why didn't you ask the painters? We've barely seen you since they landed. As if we didn't know why. They're our heroes,
Mara protested, but she was turning bluer by the second.
And it would be embarrassing.
Lynn nodded.
We're going to ask the professor, but yeah, we've been kept, We've had lots of intellectual discussions.
Mara nodded a touch frantically.
And you should see the modifications to their ship. It has a magnificent
We get it! The table crowed with laughter as the twins stammered into silence. Look, I know we've all been under a lot of pressure, Melondi said tentatively. Why don't we have movie night tonight, then go out for a drink tomorrow?
What, out in town?
Leslie spoke up.
Is that safe? We all could use a break. Maybe it's a good idea as long as we're careful. We've all been busy,
Desi offered, turning the idea over in her head. It might be good practice impersonating Mel one more time.
Even Shinshiki has been disappearing at night. I have been engaged on your behalf.
Shinshiki started prodding a papaya apart, scooping out the insides, and picking them apart with a claw.
I have tested evading the sensors. I am told it was satisfactory.
What, in your skin suit? Builder started blushing as she asked.
In somewhat less.
Zinshiki's Asaic twitched once.
It was necessary.
Less? Less than a bikini? But that meant...
But, it's cold out,
Desi stammered, as a hush fell over the girls.
Didn't you freeze your tits off? Peshrin are naturally adaptable, and it's only 40 out. In the skin suit, I am virtually invisible to sensors. Virtually may not be enough, this shell. It required field tests.
Zinshiki's Asaic slipped out of sight and focused on her papaya, as if it was the most important thing in the universe.
It was late. I was not seen. I have nothing for that.
Desi found herself staring back to Melondi. The entire table was a sea of blue now. I realize I haven't asked. Melondi looked back at her for help and Desi shrugged. There was no telling with Zenshiki sometimes. I know why everyone else is helping me. They're Shulvanti, but you're a Pezrin. This has to be more than just helping Professor Warwick as your...
Hakakt, that matters. Particularly if I am to engage a mate.
Zenshiki drew herself up, though she glanced around furtively.
Though if you take more pictures in skin suits, I wish to join in. Pezrin are not against easy money.
You can have my place, Belda offered, fervently. I'm going to be a married woman. Well, eventually. Liam might not like it if I did it again. There has to be more to it than that, Melondi asked softly. This means a great deal to me. So really, anything at all, please just name it.
Anything?
Zenshiki set aside the papaya and picked up her Asaic, grooming it modestly.
There is perhaps one thing.
Name it, Melondi said. Desi knew the tone. It was her friend sitting there, but Kalira was doing the talking.
Very well. Immunity from prosecution. From now until the end of Shell.
Zinshiki cantered ahead, as if issuing a challenge.
You are all nobles. I may be one now, but I am not Shilvanti. If you are caught, it is one thing. If I am caught, as improbable as that may be...
Done! Melondi nodded sharply and raised her voice. You have my word as what I am, before witnesses, and probably being recorded. Immunity from prosecution, a full imperial pardon for until the end of this shell. Well, Deeps, Desala breathed, as long as you're offering.
Count me in for that, Pris nodded. My mother was a magistrate. If I get expelled, she'll kill me, and they'll never find the body.
All right, fine. Kalira, princess of the Shivanti Imperium, had spoken, but Desi saw her friend Melondi, at least until she had to stifle a yawn. So, movie night tonight? Melondi offered. We still need to pick a film for next week's class. Oh, Great Waldo's Peeper has a cute guy named Redford in it. Caslin piped up with a grin. He's sexy. The one from Star Wars? Letzi cocked her head and perked up. I like him. That's Harrison Ford. This one is Redford, though his hair isn't red. Desi looked around the table at her friends as they started to talk about movies. There was no telling what the show would bring, but all the same, life went on. At least for one more day.